I think it's really worth mentioning that with all things that are new and technology, it's not really here to replace, or it's not like we're trying to take cinema and all of a sudden just slap it into theater and call
Mhm.
that a day and say, well, that's all it needs to be. I think it's just another tool that you always want to ask, like anything, why am I doing this? And I think what you just talked about is a really good reason. Okay, that's going to save me a ton of time, on the set build. So now I really can think about, well, what can projection do? But what could a piece of set do? Or maybe there's even a way to combine the two. Like I was working on a version of Puffs for a theater company in California, and they built a whole set, but they painted it like light gray with the idea they were going to projection map onto that. And
Mhm.
some of those elements they still built in 3D. They still had frames, they still had like a mantle for a fireplace. And we could do some of that literally where we could, like, where there was a frame, we could put a painting inside. But then some of it we could really step outside of that and project stuff that was more abstract on that set. And so that set then became kind of the canvas, or it became the
Mhm.
site to then project on. And of course, you can do people, you can do dresses, you can do the floor, you can do all of these different things. That's what I'm hoping people come away with, Jay, is that it's not just here to go, whoop, done, but it's just something else to consider, as a
Yeah.
part of your creative process when you're coming up with a concept for a new show.
And things for people to think about. So again, using another example, when we worked with you on when we did our production of Steel Magnolias, I built a huge set on the stage that you could see behind, and then you helped us develop seasons, right? So we had back. So then all of a sudden, I still built a giant set, 2 stories on one side, and inside of a parlor, right? It's a permanent set for Steel Magnolias, but it goes throughout time, right? So then it was fall in the background, and then it was winter, so there was no leaves on the tree, and it's just that added element rather than like, yes, it would have been fine if we just did cyc lights, and I could have just done some colors to represent the mood, but it just makes it feel that much more real and that much more it pulls the audience in that much more to just kind of feel like it keeps going. You know what I mean? That there's space beyond this set. There's the outdoors, and they you can watch the seasons change and just those kind of things. It didn't take away from, my set would have probably been the same regardless, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of, but the projections in that case, the projections added to it, right? So I think if people think about some shows, it is a addition to just raise the level that much more. And in other cases, it makes your life easier. Like, great, I now don't need to build that, which means I can make this set piece better. I can definitely tell you that when I look back, if I go back a decade, that some of my sets, because some of the shows were so big, I was building so many things that I look back at the quality and I'm like, yeah, I'm like, okay, those probably should have looked a little better. And I'm like, well, now with projections, I can build a third of those
Mhm.
things because the rest, the heavy lifting is being done by better looking objects on projections. And
Sure.
then I can make the objects I build look even better because I can now focus my time. I'm now spending 100% of my time on a third of what I used to build. So I can now make that one third of what I used to build look that much better. So overall, it raises the overall quality level of the production because time can be distributed more evenly where it needs to be and let the projections do some of the heavy lifting. So I think there's multiple cases. It can just be to supplement and make things look a little bit better, but it can also be on the other end of like, great, this, some shows you do, you're like, why are there 32 scenes in the show? They're like, it's a traveling show. So you go to so many different places and that just becomes unreasonable, right? You do something like Steel Magnolias, which takes place in one room the entire show, and you're like,
Sure.
great. And then you do something like, I don't know, either Honk or Wizard of Oz was a good example, right? Wizard of Oz, we've done Wizard of Oz with and without projections. And without projections, you're building so much, right? There's
Mhm.
so much stuff, and you're supplementing with just lights when you can, right? Whereas
Right.
if you do a version with projections, now you're different part of the forest, different part of the forest, different part of the yellow brick road, different part of the, and make it look like different locations so much easier. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. I do want to go back to one thing that you said because you touched on it so quick, but I was like, wow, that's a really good tip. And actually, especially when I talk to dance directors, ballet directors, this comes up a lot because when they're thinking about going from a traditional backdrop, a piece of fabric that may have hung the full length of their stage, and then they make that leap into to digital scenery or using projections. I think the first thought is, well, I've got to fill everything. So if
Mhm.
I've got 50 or 60 feet, it's got to be full of scenery, which, as you know, filling that kind of width can be challenging. I mean, you can use two projectors. There's some ways you can seam things together, but it also can get kind of expensive. So I
Mhm.
think that thing that you mentioned of, maybe bringing your travelers in or just like framing in a smaller space
Mhm.
and not necessarily feeling like you have to fill everything. You can do a lot as long as you really suggest to the audience, here is that space where the world starts and stops.
Yeah. To give you, what you said is exactly. So every summer we do a large summer camp for kids at a different theater, which used to be the old theater that we used to do. So that is a much bigger space, and we use that old projector that I talked about, the lower, little bit lower end. So I take the back black traveler and I bring it in a decent amount, and then I take the border and I bring it in from above. So I've got a black, so the cyc is technically 45 feet wide by 20 feet tall, and I probably bring that in to like 30 feet, maybe even 25 feet wide by like 15 feet tall. So I just kind of frame it in. And once you do that and you bring in all your curtains and everything else, when the audience walks in, they don't really think about it, right? Like you said, you're showing them the frame space that I want you to see, and my projection now fits in that space. It looks like it's meant to be, right? Nobody goes, "Oh, that's weird. Why aren't they filling that?" It looks like you're
Right.
filling all of your available space. So yeah, you can trim in. Something else I saw somebody do. So something you could think about is, let's say you're going to do a production of Into the Woods, for an example. You could build a framework of trees and things to bring in your space and then project in that smaller space, right? Let
Mm,
that be what changes, but that you keep kind of an overall frame that stays the whole time, right? So I
right.
think those are ways that you can supplement of like, hey, we can't quite fill this big of space, so let's just trim, there's creative ways to trim your space to get a little bit smaller area if need be.
Yeah, I think when you said, Jay, you talked about I could put a color gel back there. I think that's a good way to think about projection sometimes, and even projectors. This is another light.
Hmm.
At its very basic form, a projector could even produce for you an orange light, a blue light, a red light,
Absolutely.
whatever. But then you also can introduce some shapes. In fact, and I think for some reason Sleepy Hollow comes to my mind when I think of this show, but there are some projections I've produced for that where you get that really dense atmospheric fog, that's built into the content itself. Like when you're looking at misty London, for example, or in Sleepy Hollow, you're looking at the village, you may only see the shape of those buildings with
Hmm.
maybe a little bit of detail. And as it moves further and further back, the shapes become lighter and lighter. And what's cool about that is that you get this incredible sense of depth. And that's one of the things I like about projection too. It's kind of like having a mirror inside of an actual room. It sort of expands the canvas also deep so that
Absolutely.
people feel like the world extends much deeper than it really actually does. You can kind of produce that illusion.
Absolutely. And in fact, something you're mentioning that back in the day when we had a fly system, the way we would have achieved what you're talking about is probably, cut a silhouette, do a lot of framing, a lot of sheeting, cut a small town silhouette and fly it in on the fly system and try to fog it and light behind it. And yeah, it would have probably looked really cool, but that's a lot of work for possibly one scene. Uh, to still not even technically get quite as good of a look as you'll get with what you're talking about with the projection, right? And that's right now for the production of Oklahoma that we have your projection for. If it was just lights, the stage would feel like it stopped right
Mm.
behind the house, right? But instead, it feels like there's a field, and so like it gives the illusion of space and depth. I think it's a great analogy of like putting a mirror in a room, right? Where you're like, it all of a sudden makes the room feel bigger. So depending on the projection you're using, it makes your stage feel bigger. It can make your stage feel bigger if it's an outdoor space, or if it's a room with depth, or anything that has any depth to it. All of a sudden, you get the illusion of feeling like there's more space on stage. I think that's absolutely true.